I had cleared that statement with every relevant agency of the U.S. government. In 1999, no one in the U.S. government thought there would ever be a reason for the U.S. to try to justify the use of torture. But in just a few years, we've gone from a zero tolerance policy to a zero accountability policy. And this now affects our popular culture. If you read the New Yorker magazine, you know, before 9/11, on television, they showed only about 4 torture scenes a year. Since 9/11, the average number has risen to 100 a year. And some television shows, like 24, show American government officials committing torture every week, sometimes before every commercial break. And the question we should ask ourselves, is this really making us safer? After all, 24 is the single most exported show by DVD to Morocco and Egypt. And if millions of television viewers in the Middle East think that Americans think it's fine routinely to torture their detainees, how safe will our soldiers and citizens be if they come into their custody? And what impact does this have on our ability to solve problems in the Middle East? As the Washington Post noted, we're no longer a player in most of the countries on most issues. They don't listen to us anymore. They openly make moves that go against our policies and strategy. So this is the problem. How do we repair our tarnished human rights reputation? Now I know, as a nation, as families, we are facing huge problems. Just today, a market meltdown, the collapse of financial institutions, the price of gas and housing and food. But as a law dean and a human rights lawyer, please don't ignore what I think is such a serious problem. The reason is simple. Since World War II, our country was the balance wheel of the global human rights system because it was our reputation for commitment to the rule of law that made us the engine that drove that system. In the post-Cold War world, from the fall of the Berlin Wall to the fall of the Twin Towers, we tried to revive that system in the Balkans, in Sierra Leone, East Timor. But since 9/11, we have sided with Pakistan in defending torture. We've sided with China in defending arbitrary detention of Uyghur Muslims. We've sided with Russia in defending human rights abuses against Chechens as part of a war on terror. And when our human rights system loses its balance wheel, why should we be surprised when the world goes out of whack? And so in the last few months, we've seen the constitutionalization of emergency rule in Egypt, the loss of democracy in Pakistan, stolen elections in Zimbabwe and Burma, and U.S. officials who will not say that waterboarding is torture, even when it's committed by foreign troops against our own soldiers. As Tom Friedman recently pointed out, last year was the worst year for freedom since the end of the Cold War. Almost 4 times as many states declined in their freedom scores as improved. And the common element of the least democratic countries in the world is that they derive most of their revenue from oil. So as the price of fuel rises, and with it food, we have to cut reliance on fossil fuels, not just to save money, not just to protect the environment, not just to promote national security, but to promote the rule of law, because this dangerous dependence weakens democracy worldwide. Well, if that's the problem, what's the solution? The answer could take hours, but let me just suggest 3 simple steps. First, and most simply, we have to return to telling the truth. We have to say simple things. Waterboarding is torture. The leaders of Pakistan, Burma, and Zimbabwe are crushing democracy and the rule of law. Second, we have to stop pushing for double standards in human rights. If human rights are universal, we have to respect them even for suspected terrorists. We should not have law-free courts that we call military commissions. We should not have law-free zones, which we call Guantanamo. We should not have law-free practices, which we call extraordinary rendition or extreme interrogation measures, and we shouldn't have law-free persons that we call enemy combatants. 2 years ago, the Supreme Court held that even terrorist suspects are bound to respect, with regard to them, the government is bound to respect Common Article 3 of the Geneva Convention. And a few days later, I testified before the Senate, and one senator said to me, "Professor," now I give you a hint, in Washington, inside the Beltway, the word professor is not a term of respect. He said, "Professor, the last time I checked, the terrorists had not signed the Geneva Conventions." And I said, "Senator, the last time I checked, the whales hadn't signed the Whaling Convention either." The fact of the matter is it's not about them and who they are. It's about us and who we are. It's not a matter of contract. It's about how we're obliged to treat them, however they behave. And as a matter of universal principle, we must give all detainees basic humane treatment, whatever heinous conduct they may have committed. Third, we need to put our own house in order and fast. This should be a prime task for a new administration. How to do it? I would suggest 4 specific steps: clearing Guantanamo, issuing executive orders, introducing national security legislation, supporting international law and institutions. Closing Guantanamo. Amazingly, the President, the Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General, 8 presidential candidates, and all of our allies think it should be closed, and yet it continues. Why? Because of the difficulties of the interagency process in dealing with allies who will not take their detainees back. This is something that should be addressed during the transition, before the inauguration. The Justice Department, State, Defense, Intelligence, the White House should work together to close the camp. How to do it? First, they should review all of the detainees who are there, less than 300. They fall into 4 categories: those who should be extradited, those who should be repatriated, those should be resettled, and then a very tiny group, the high-value detainees, who should be brought to the United States for prosecution in regular federal courts, held in security prisons if necessary. Immediately after the election, in November I'm talking about, not January, the new administration should appoint a high-level confidant to the president-elect to be a special envoy who should go abroad to negotiate with the countries who have populations on Guantanamo and tell them the future of your relationship with the new administration depends on whether you're ready to repatriate your detainees with appropriate diplomatic assurances that they will not be tortured. And those assurances should be monitored by diplomats, the Red Cross, human rights non-governmental groups. The Defense Department should shut down the facilities on Guantanamo, which never was supposed to be a prison camp in the first place. The Office of Detainee Affairs should be brought under a human rights lawyer, and a similar legal counsel position should be created at Homeland Security. The Justice Department should file, with regard to habeas petitions, requests for delay, and incoming attorneys to all of the major legal offices, White House Counsel, Office of Legal Counsel at Justice, and Defense should be given access to all classified legal opinions to withdraw those which should never have been written in the first place. And when the president takes office on January 20th, he should issue 4 executive orders. First, closing Guantanamo by a date certain. Second, directing all U.S. officials and those under contract anywhere in the world to obey the Torture Convention and the Geneva Conventions. Third, to ban the use of waterboarding and other cruel treatment by anyone employed or under contract to the U.S. anywhere in the world. And then to clarify that vague statutes like the authorization of use of military force resolution was not intended to override existing legislation or modify pre-existing legal rights. The president should establish a national security law committee under the direction of the Attorney General, which would include the Secretary of State and Defense and the National Intelligence Advisor, as a decision-making body to make sure good legal advice on national security issues gets to the president. He should create an independent commission, like the 9/11 Commission, to look into and, if necessary, recommend accountability measures for past abuses. And he should forswear executive or legislative efforts to avoid habeas corpus by moving detainees to offshore locations, by extraordinary rendition to black sites. Third, we need new national security legislation of the kind that was introduced after Watergate, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. That legislation should repeal the Military Commissions Act, revise classified information procedures. Now, some people, incredibly, are suggesting that at this moment, we should create a new terror court. A lot of people are suggesting this, a secret court for terrorists. And my question is, since when did our standard of justice become at least it's better than Guantanamo?